Hello and welcome to SIY-Sew It Yourself. Today we're going to be making a really fun, usable gift or just something that you can use in your own home and kitchen. That's going to be a double-handed oven mitt. These are really great because they can just hang over the handle of your oven, so it's always there when you need it. And both of them are there because I don't know about you, but I sometimes can find one pot holder but not the second. So I like to have these on all the time so I can just grab it when I'm baking with my kids or making bread at home, things like that. It's just fabulous. So it's a really easy, beginner-friendly project, and it doesn't take a lot of fabric or materials, so it's a really great giftable project as well if you're looking for something to make for the holidays or maybe a housewarming gift or bridal shower, things like that. Really is a lot of fun. So let's talk about what you need in order to make this happen. You are going to need obviously the pattern, which you can get at SIY-Sewityyourself.com or from a participating SIY retailer. Also in there, it's going to include a template. Make sure when you print out the template that the square measures 1 inch. You're just going to place your ruler over it and make sure you print it at 100% scale and you should be just fine. I know sometimes we get questions here from people who don't have printers at home or who aren't used to printing and have trouble with that. If you have issues, you can take it to a local print center near you, or your local library is always able to help as well. All right, we need a couple more things. We need some paper scissors to cut out our template. We need some fabric scissors because we're going to be making bias binding, which is a lot easier than it sounds, in order to go around the curved edges of our double oven mitt. And I like to have little scissors, little embroidery scissors as I'm working to cut the little bits. For this one, you're gonna want some coordinating thread. You can hand stitch the binding down for this, but I'm gonna show you how to do it and have it look neat for doing it on everything on your machine, so that way it can go even faster. Now, when you're assembling things and holding things in place, these clips are really great for that, as opposed to pins, because you are going to be dealing with a lot of thick layers here. And the pattern doesn't talk about this, but I'm going to use this heat and bond seam tape in order to get my binding to be in the correct spot on the wrong side. That way I can just stitch over it with my machine and know that it's going to look good. Rotary cutter is also good to have. And then we're going to need a fat quarter of fabric for our bias binding, and that's going to go around the edges of our double oven mitt. You're also going to need 2½ yards, one for the outside and one for the inside. And then you're going to need a ½ yard of batting, so you can use your scraps if you want. And then you're going to need a ½ yard of insole bright. This is a heat reflective material that is going to push the heat back toward the hot thing that you are taking out of the oven. And so it's a really great material to use. And when you layer it with batting, it really does provide some really great protection to your hands when you're getting really hot things out of the oven. I love to make bread and pizzas, so I'm regularly pulling things out of the oven that are 475 degrees, and I am just fine with this combination. So it really is a great option for you guys. It is not microwavable, however, because there is metallic in the insole bright, so do not make the mistake of putting that in the microwave. You're not going to have a good experience if you do that. One thing I forgot, I have a bias tape maker with me. Now, this is not essential. There's lots of tutorials on how to make bias tape with just putting 2 pins in your ironing board. That totally works, but this makes it really handy, and if you really like this method, this could be something that you use a lot. I also like to use it to make specialty hem casings like you buy at, the fabric stores where they're prepackaged, but you can make them to go with coordinate with the fabric from the line that you're making. And I love using them on armholes for children's garments and the bottom hems. It just is a really fun little touch and pop of color. So the first thing you want to do is go ahead and follow the cutting instructions to be able to create the pieces for the long handle part of it and the pockets. Then we're going to use our paper scissors to cut out our template. I've already double checked that my square measures 1 inch by laying a ruler over it, so we're good to go. So I can just trim this up now. All right, now we're going to grab all of our 7x9 pieces. You should have 2 of your main print, 2 of your lining, 2 of your batting, and 2 of your insole bright. And that's going to make up all of our layers for the outside pocket of our long-handled oven mitt. So we're going to start by putting our lining fabric wrong side up. And this print is directional. So you can see here that the whole fabric kind of has this ombre thing going on where the color fade changes with each column. So I'm making sure that my darker greens, or well, I guess medium green sections here are on the bottom and my lighter green sections are on the top, because I cut this specifically so that it's going to line up with the rest of the fabric later. So I'm going to keep those facing in the same direction. Next, we're going to take our insole bright, and there are two different sides to the insole bright. I'm going to zoom in so you guys can kind of see the difference here. Now, this is something that might be a little easier to tell in person, but this is the heat resistant side of the insole bright. You can see that there are tiny silver dots everywhere. That is the heat resistant side, and this is the non-heat resistant side where it is just plain white. It looks like maybe fusible batting or something. Now what we want to do is lay it so that the heat resistant side of the batting, so the side that has all those silver dots, is face down so that it's facing the wrong side of our lining fabric. Because if you think about it, we're going to be pulling it out of the oven with that lining fabric. So we want to make sure that the heating part is headed in that direction, or it's not going to do as good of a job at keeping your hands protected when you are cooking. So do make sure that you are lining these up, and they should fit perfectly on top of each other. If they don't, it means you miscut something. So we want to make sure that we address that before we go any further. Next, we're going to put the batting on top. Batting does kind of have a right and a wrong side, but it doesn't matter for our purposes here. We just want an extra layer for warmth. And you can always add yet another layer of batting too if you find that you're still having issues. But I find that one layer is plenty for me. All right, finally, we are going to end with the right side of our main fabric. So this is the outer fabric that you're going to see when it's hanging over your oven handle facing straight up, and I think it looks pretty good. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get our oven mitt template on here, and I'm going to show you a little tip. If you have fabric that has any kind of direction to it, maybe there's an up and down of characters that are on it and you want all the heads to be going up in the same direction for both the pocket and the main part of the body, this is how you do it. So this is my lining, and you can see this is the end. So this is where the tip of the curved part of the oven mitt is going to be. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to flip it over because that's the part that I want to line up nicely. And obviously I've got to flip these around here and make sure that that is going, so that way when I put these on and layer it up, it's going to look like the same piece. It's going to be really kind of cool that way. And it's going to look pretty good. I wouldn't worry too much about the columns not lining up perfectly, because we are going to have a piece of binding over top of this to kind of provide a break in the sight line. So don't worry about that. But if you're trying to make sure that, you know, directions like this are going correctly, or if there's heads of characters that are both pointing in one direction, make sure that you take a second to make sure you have everything lined up before you place your double oven mitt template on top. So I'm going to go ahead and place this so that the curve is even with the bottom. Now this template is just a tad bit longer than the 7x9 piece of fabric. That's okay. It's the bottom part that matters. So now I'm going to take the clips and I'm going to put them around. And what I like to do is have one at the top corner, one right before the corner starts to move on me. And then we're going to do one more at the bottom. So what I like to do next is actually trace around where I'm going to be cutting. And you can do this with a pencil, you can use a friction gel pen. I'm going to use a permanent marker today just so you can see it on the camera. I would not recommend this on your actual project because it might bleed or move, but you're not going to see the edges. So it's fine. We're going to put binding over that. Now this paper template is rather inflexible. So what I like to do at this point is just unclip it and take that part off as I'm working around. And then I'm going to take my fabric scissors and I'm going to cut through all of the sides. Next, we want to make sure to secure all of these layers together. So what we're going to do is we're going to stitch a basting stitch around all of the edges of the pocket, and we're going to try to do that within the seam allowance. So basically try to eyeball it so it's less than a 1/4 inch in, and if you see a little bit, you're going to have matching thread. It's going to be okay. So whenever I'm doing a task like this, I like to use my walking foot. It has feed dogs on the top and the bottom, which makes it a lot easier to move through multiple layers evenly, which is going to be really important for this project, just like if you were quilting or binding. At this point, it's a good idea to take a look at the top and the bottom to make sure you have caught all the layers. Right over here, I've just barely caught this, but it is secure, so that's going to be fine. If not, you might just want to come in a little bit and grab that, and it's totally normal for stuff to shift a little bit. It's not going to damage the way that your final product turns out. Now I'm going to go ahead and repeat this with the other pocket and also the ends of our long-handled oven mitt, so that way we have rounded edges and the same layering order for all of our other pieces. One tip that I think is really helpful when you're working on the long piece of the double-handed oven mitt is get one side ready first and then kind of smooth all your pieces down as you're working on them, making sure you're getting your edges nice and aligned and everything is nice and straight. Because, you know, as much as we try really hard to cut everything to the right measurements, sometimes they're not perfect. And so that way we can work our way down and then we can give this a nice little trim to square it off at the end before we start adding our template to cut it to size. So now when I take a look at this and I pull everything back, I can see that my layers are not even. So I'm just going to take my rotary cutter blade and square it up and shave a little bit off, and it'll be just fine. Now we're going to do our basting stitch around the edges of this one as well, and make sure you flip it over when you're done to make sure you've caught all the layers, because this one is the one that's most likely to shift around on you. So once you finish basting the edges of your pockets and your long-handled oven mitt, you can set those aside and we're going to make some bias binding. So the first thing we need to do is square up our fat quarter. I usually start to give a nice straight edge with this by cutting off my selvage. Then you're going to rotate it and you're going to line up the bottom of your piece that we've just cut, so that way an inch line is even with it. And then when we cut along the edge here, we're going to have a good 90-degree angle. And then we're going to continue rotating and trimming until we have 90-degree angles on all 4 sides. If you're planning your own kit for this, stripes and checks always look great on bias binding because they end up being at that 45-degree angle when it wraps around, and it looks fabulous. All right, so now it comes time to actually start cutting our bias. So most rulers are going to have a couple of different degree lines on it. We want the one that is 45 degrees. Now I'm going to line up that 45-degree line even with the corner, and it can be any corner, it doesn't matter. And we're going to cut across. Flip that up. And I've got to pull it down just a smidge so I got enough room up here. But I'm just going to continue lining up the ruler with the edge that I cut and be able to cut right up the rest of the side there. Now you're going to have one 90-degree angle and one 90-degree angle that is a little extra. You got a little bit left there, but we're going to use this. So what we're going to do is we're going to flip them right sides together so that our straight edges are even. Because we have done this, they should be the same size, and we're going to go ahead and pin across the top. I like to put one pin in the corner, and then we're going to line up the tip of the triangle with the top corner here. And then you can throw one, or I would do 3 pins, just one in the middle and then at the quarters. Now we're going to stitch a 1/4 inch stitch along here. If you don't want to take your walking foot off to do this, that's fine. You can do that with your walking foot on. Now your fabric should look something like this. We're going to flip it over and press that seam open. This is the part where it can get a little confusing, because what we're going to do is we're going to mark lines every 2.5 inches to create our bias strips and know where to mark everything. And what you need to keep in mind is that we're going to be marking along the stretchy side. So if you come over here, you can see it's not stretching too much, but if we come here, there's a lot of stretch. So this is our bias edge. That's what we want, and we want that stretch so that it will fold very neatly around the rounded edges of our pot holder so that it'll look really nice going around that. And you're only going to get that on the bias edge. The other way to tell is when you take your ruler to start marking the lines, you're not going to be able to go all the way across when you're working on a bias edge from a fat quarter. But if you're going from the straight of grain edge, you can see I can go all the way across. So if you can mark it all in one go, you're probably on the wrong edge. And if you're going to need to slide your ruler down, then you've got the right one. All right, so I'm just lining up my 2.5 inch mark with the bottom edge of my piece here. And I'm going to go ahead and just take a pencil. I like to use a pencil or something that is not going to go away with this, because we're not going to see it. It's going to be folded on the inside. And also when you're pressing later, if you choose to press before you cut everything apart, this makes it so that the lines don't go away, because my other marking tools that are specifically meant for quilting are friction gel pens that go away with heat. So this kind of makes it easier that you don't mark it all and pin it and sew it and then not know where you're supposed to cut because your lines disappeared. That's no fun. All right, so I've got my first line marked 2.5 inches from the edge. So now I'm going to put the 2.5 inch mark on the line that I just drew, which is going to give me the distance I need in order to be able to do the next bit. Now we're going to keep repeating that process all the way up our fat quarter. There's one more thing I'm going to mark on here before we put this together to make our tube, and that's a 1/4 inch mark on the sides where the lines here are meeting the edge. This is going to give me a mark to pin in by just going right across where all of that is, because that's going to give me my seam allowance, and I'm going to be able to put my pin right through there. I'm going to do that on both sides. Now what we're going to do is we're going to match up our lines here and pin them together, but it needs to be offset, so that way when we get it sewn together, it's going to come off in kind of a spiral, like when you're taking the cardboard off of a biscuit tube, as opposed to rings. And that's going to give us one continuous strip of bias binding that's about 5 yards long, which is perfect for what we're going to be doing today. The easiest way for me to do this is to actually just kind of fold it in on itself like this. So that way my edges are kind of meeting together. Now here's where you kind of have to pay attention. So if I were to put it like this, if I zoom in, you can see that each of my lines are matching up and all my edges are even. That's what we don't want. If we do that, then it's going to come off in slices as rings of fabric instead of a spiral. So what you're actually going to do is we're going to line it up with an offset. And this is the awkward part of bias binding, because we want our first line on one side to be even with the second line on the other side. It doesn't really matter which side you start with as long as it's offset. So this way I'm going to be able to cut in with my scissors here, and this one is actually a skinny strip that's at the end, but I'm going to be able to start cutting here and keep going round and round and round, and it's going to come off in one giant spiral. All right, so now what I'm going to do, we can see here I've got my pencil marks here where I'm a 1/4 inch away from the edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my pin in one of those where it's crossing the lines that I made for our bias strip tubes. And then I'm going to put it through the other one like this. And so I've got it through both of those lines. And then I'm going to take this piece here and I'm lining it up so that my edges are straight. And once I have that, I'm going to go ahead and just pin straight down. Now, if you've seen any of my tutorials on the Quilt Addicts Anonymous channel about double pinning I do that a lot, and I don't ever move this down. I wouldn't ever just shift it and put it down. For this situation, that's totally fine. There's no problem with that because it's more or less a guide than a rule. All right, so we're going to keep working down. I'm going to go ahead and pin where I have my 1/4 inch marked on one side, and you can see that I'm off on this side. So I'm going to go ahead and move that over a little bit. That way my pin is coming through on the line that I marked and where the 1/4 inch seam is. Again, we're going to line up those edges and pin. And I'm going to keep doing that all the way down. All right, so now we have this thing that looks super awkward, admittedly, right now. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of straighten it out. And I find that it's really hard to like straighten it all the way out when you start. You kind of have to do it as you work through. But you can see that I've got a nice flat seam up here. So I'm just going to start with that. I'm going to sew my 1/4 inch seam all the way down and then just make sure that those edges are aligned all the way down through here. And I promise it looks super weird, but it absolutely 100% is going to work perfectly. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I really hate going through and removing my walking foot and putting it back on. So I'm just going to sew this entire project with it on because it makes it easier. Now, if you were working with a bigger bias binding, like for a quilt, perhaps you could go through and press the seam open now. I don't like to do that when I'm working with a fat 1/4 because you can see it's like rounding to the back. But what you should have right now is looking pretty much like what we have here, where we have an end that's kind of hanging off. So what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to be following these lines to cut, and it's going to be coming off in a spiral to create my giant bias binding. And then I'm going to go through and I'm going to press open all of these seams individually later, just because I find that a little bit easier for me. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start cutting on this line. And this is the part that I don't love about bias binding, because you don't end up with that nice clean edge that you have when you have the rotary cutter. But just wait till we get around to the next part. You're going to see how this works. All right, so here we are at our seam that we just sewed together. And I'm going to go ahead and just cut right across there, following on the line to the next bit. And you can see if I lay that back out that this is coming off in a nice spiral, and it's going to keep doing that as I cut around. If you have a ring at this point, then that means you didn't do your offset correctly. So just go ahead and pay attention to that and maybe redo it. One thing to note here, this last strip over here is not 2.5 inches. So once you get to this skinny part, we're just going to cut that off, and you can save it for scrap or toss it, whatever is your preference. All right, so here's my skinny strip. I'm just going to go ahead and give that a slice before the seam, so that way I don't have to worry about that. All right, so now we have our big long bias strip. It's nice and stretchy, so it's going to go around the edges of our oven mitt really well. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and press open these seams here, and then we're going to get them turned in on themselves to create the inner fold that's going to wrap around really nicely and create a really beautiful look. So we're going to use a bias tape maker for the next step. You probably are going to see ones like this in the store a lot. There also are some independent companies that makes ones like this. What matters is the size. You want one that's meant for 2.5 inch wide strips. So that's what this one here is for. So I'm going to go ahead and set that to the side. Next, I'm going to take a spray mister and I'm just going to spritz the fabric just a little bit. This kind of gives you the effect of steaming your iron without having to put water in your iron, because I hate doing that because it eventually gunks it up. And then I'm just going to slide the tip of the fabric through, and then it takes a little bit of finagling when you first get going to get everything to fold in half nicely. Now I like this particular one because the typical bias tape makers are just going to fold it into the center. This one also is going to fold it in half for you too. So what I can do is I can get that first part started, and I can put my iron down, and then I can kind of just keep it going. Every once in a while, if you're using a tool like this, you kind of have to readjust on the edges to make sure that it's feeding in the way you want. So I'll just pull a little bit down and then give it a nice little flip and just work a little bit at a time. You don't want to go super fast at this, but what you should be seeing when you open this up is that the fabrics are going in towards the center like that. It's ideal if they're meeting in the center like this, but you certainly don't have to take time to get it absolutely perfect. What matters is that they're about the same size. All right, so now we have all our bias tape. You can wrap it up and make it look pretty, or we're gonna use it immediately, so that works too. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna put it on the top flat surface of our pockets for our hands to go in to cover up this seam here. So if you look at the front, you can see that it's not nice and even. So we wanna make sure that we're giving ourselves a nice clean edge where we have all four corners to start. And now we're gonna need enough to cover the top. So I'm gonna give myself maybe like a little inch extra here. And we're gonna do that with both. Now, if I open this up, I can see that the bias tape maker didn't put it in exactly perfect. The one I used was actually meant for the jelly roll rug. But what you can do, it doesn't matter, as long as it's kind of even across, it's no big deal. Eventually what's going to happen is our oven mitt is going to fit nicely in here. But I'm going to sew it on in a little bit different way, so that way I can ensure that I'm catching both sides and everything looks super nice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up, and you can see 3 distinct fold lines from when I pressed it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up the edge here. So that way when I flip this up, it's going to cover, because I can see this is a little bit wider than it should be. So I'm going to line it up even with the edge, and I'm going to stitch inside this seam here. And I'm doing it on the edge that ended up a little wider because I think that's going to work out better for me. But I'm just going to stitch right down this fold line, keeping the edge of my bias strip even with the edge of my flat side of my pocket. And just to kind of keep that in place, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of clip that just to help keep everything in place. I'm going to do that with both of them. All right, I'm going to remove that first clip. It was just to kind of keep everything in place. Go ahead and slide everything under, and I'm going to go ahead and just start stitching. And I'm stitching right down that fold that was created when I put it through the bias tape maker. Go ahead and sew off and add the next one in. Now your bias tape might stretch out a little bit on you as you're doing this and you're sewing it on to start with. That's fine. It's totally normal. That's what bias tape does. It's not a problem. Now in my original one, I did this next step by hand, but I'm going to show you how to do it by machine to make it even faster. So what we're going to do next is we're going to go ahead and flip everything, so that way everything is coming up nicely over the top. Then we're going to fold it in half along that fold line that we originally had, and we're going to flip it over. So what I did on my original is I went through this and I stitched it all by hand using the same stitch you would use if you're doing quilt binding. But what I'm going to do here to make it faster is I'm going to use some hem tape. I really like the Heat and Bond hem tape. I use it actually when I'm starting to do all of my bindings on my quilts, so that way everything is in place before I have to sit and hand stitch it. So I'm just going to go ahead and rip off a piece that is as wide as my hem tape here, and then I'm going to place my binding strip over top of it, careful to kind of make sure that it's nice and even and that it is it feels even with the one that's below it as well. And then I'm also covering the stitching line for attaching the original. So now I can go ahead and press that over. And once it cools, that is stuck in place. It's not going to go anywhere, and everything is good to go. And then what I can do is from the right side, I can zigzag stitch over the top of this, and that's going to add a little decorative element. I know that this is going to be nice and secure in the back, and it's going to look neat. Now, if you are very anal retentive about having everything be perfect and not being able to see stitches and maybe being a little off in the back, then hand stitching is still going to be for you. But this is a nice alternative to that, especially if you want to make a bunch for gifts for the holiday. This is a good way to kind of assembly line that process and speed it up. Now for this next part, I'm just lining up the middle of my walking foot with the seam of where I stitched on by machine on the right side of that, and I'm just doing a regular zigzag stitch over the top. This is also another time where you can bust out those decorative stitches on your machine that you may not always have use for, and you're able to just really cover this really nicely, use coordinating thread, and it'll look very nice. So we're just going to take a look at that from the front. It looks really nice. Everything is nice and tidy. It's centered really nicely over the two stitches. If we go to the back, you can see that it's not perfectly even over this, but everything is nice and secure, and it's going to be fine. So like I said, if you're someone who this would bother you that it's not exactly even on the bottom, then perhaps you want to consider hand stitching with the same stitch you would use to bind a quilt with. But if you just want to get it done quickly, this is a perfectly fine option. I'm going to go ahead and trim the bias strips so that they are even with the edges. So now we have to attach our pockets to the main part of our long handle pot holder. Then we're ready to add binding all around, and we're going to be all done. We're almost there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of the pockets and I'm going to line it up with the edge of the pot holder like this. And I'm going to go ahead and put some clips in to hold everything in place. This is going to be a lot of layers to go through, so make sure you're using that walking foot. Then I'm going to stitch within the seam allowance, starting above where the pocket is and going all around. Make sure you reinforce those stitches just so that pocket is on there nice and sturdy. We're going to do that on both sides. If you haven't already, make sure you're switching back to that straight stitch from the zigzag stitch. I'm going to go ahead and reinforce this as well by stitching back and forth, just so that nothing rips open while we're assembling. All right, so as you're doing this, be careful that you're making sure to keep your edges together, because we want to make sure we're getting through both the pocket and the rest of the oven mitt. All right, before we move forward, it's a good idea to check to make sure that you have stitched all the way through on both sides, because sometimes things can shift a little bit, especially when we have this many layers. All right, I'm going to go ahead and flip everything back to the right side. Now we're going to do the same process that we did before. You have two options when it comes to joining your binding. You could join it the way you do when you're doing continuous binding on a quilt, or we can tuck it, which is what I'm going to do here. It's faster and it's going to save you some time. So to tuck it under starts when we get started here. So we can see we're going to apply it the same way we did on our pocket. We're going to flip everything open. I'm not going to clip all around this because the bias is probably going to stretch a little bit on me as I go. So I'm not really going to worry too much about that. But we're going to sew in this first pressing line here. And what we want to have at the beginning here is a nice fold. So that way when we come back around this way, we can just slide the raw edge of fabric in. and then we don't have to worry about being fancy. So I'm just gonna fold over 1/2 inch or so. And so when I get started, I'm just gonna go ahead and put a clip here just to hold maybe the first couple of inches just to help me get started, and then that's all I'm gonna clip. I'm gonna get started sewing right here a little bit before where I started, and then I'm just gonna stitch all the way around. And then when we get all the way around to the other side, we're gonna be able to just slide our raw edge in here. And when everything gets folded up, we're only gonna see a nice folded edge, and so it saves you a little bit of time. But again, if you wanna be fussy with this, you certainly can, and you can close it up the way you would with continuous quilt binding as well. All right, whenever I start binding, I do kind of like to do a back stitch just to secure it nicely. And now we're just gonna make our way around, sewing that binding to the right side, making sure to keep that needle in the first pressing fold that we made when we put it through our bias tape maker. I'm starting to come to the curve, so this is where I'm going to really slow down, and this is why we had to use that bias binding, because it's just going to wrap really nicely around the edges and make a really nice smooth finish. If we would have used straight grain binding, there's no way that would have happened for us. So I'm just going slow. I'm doing a lot of lifting and moving things around as I work on them. All right, I am back to the beginning. So because I am doing the tuck method, all I need to do is line up my fabric with where I was. And I am going to give it a little bit of a clip here. So that way I'm not going too far underneath. But I just want to have a single layer. And my goal with giving it that clip is so that I can line up my fold with the original stitching line so that I'm not going over by too much here. And I can keep that nice and even all around. Go ahead and backstitch a little bit and cut your threads. So now what we're going to do is we're going to flip all of this binding around to the other side. I like to kind of do that part first. It's going to just want to go around the curve. It's the lovely part of bias binding. It just kind of comes around and hugs it, and you don't have to fuss with it too much. It lays beautifully. For the straighter grains, it's not going to be quite as much. I'm going to go ahead and use this fusible hem tape again to go ahead and press everything in place, just like I did when we were doing our pocket binding. And that way everything is in place and I can zigzag stitch around it and have this done fairly quickly. Again, you can hand bind this. I have hand bound these before. They look fantastic. I think it's worth the time. But if that's not your cup of tea or you just want it to be done, this is a perfectly fine option. When I'm doing a longer piece like this or I'm working on a quilt, what I like to do is keep everything on the roll and kind of just unroll it as I need it. I'm going to start at my sort of straight of grain here right before I get to my curve. And I think that is going to work the best for me. So what I'm doing is I'm pulling that over. I'm trying to make sure that I'm covering both the hem tape and all of my stitching lines because I don't want to see any of my basting stitches or anything where I attach things to the front of it. I just want it to be attached and not visible at all there. And I just like to work in little increments, maybe 4 or 5 inches at a time. And I'm someone where I would rather have the front look absolutely fantastic and perfect. So I'm just making sure that I'm like evenly filling the outside of this. The front is going to look pretty good too, but I want to make sure that if I have any excess binding, like from where it didn't fold over like perfectly evenly or something, I want that to go to the back because you're going to see that really only when you're using it, whereas the front you're going to see all the time when it's not in use and it's hanging over your oven handle. All right, I'm coming to the point where I have my tuck. So I'm going to start by just handling the tuck because that matters. That's what's going to actually fuse. Be careful not to touch your iron to that. And then for this portion here, where I have my secondary part here, that's going to be going around, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it underneath. Actually, that's what I should have done first. Let's back that up. So if you are unhappy with something, you can pull it off right away, like I'm doing here. No big deal. I'm going to just put that part to the side. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to tuck all of this under first, and then I'm going to give it a nice little fuse. So if your fusing tape breaks or you make a mistake like that, no big deal. You can just reinsert it and press over the top. Now that is a little bulky. That would be a reason maybe why you might want to go ahead and go with the continuous binding method. But I'm also going to put a little clip over that just to keep that in place because there's just a lot going on there. I want it to stay put. All right, we are now coming to the curve, and you can see that this is coming in really nicely, but I still want to do a good job of securing it down. So I'm kind of pushing that tape into the corner. And just making my way around slowly. And this will kind of fold on itself, the tape, it's fine, and it'll still hold. You can see that held really well going around there. But like I said, just take your time, go around, make sure everything is covered that you want to have covered, and you'll be good. All right, I'm just about to where I started. I'm kind of estimating where I think I'm going to need the rest of it to be. And if I'm close enough, that's going to be fine. We just want it to be secured enough to be able to go around it without having to clip everything and maybe have things shift around on us underneath. This way we know that everything is going to be nice and tidy and look beautiful from both sides. All right, we're gonna give it one last check just to make sure that I'm not seeing any stitching lines going around here, that everything is fused really nicely, and everything is looking really good from this side. So I'm gonna go ahead and flip it over. I'm probably gonna start right where my tuck is so I can make sure to secure that first. And I'm gonna do the same zigzag stitch going all around that I did from here. When you get to the end, just go ahead and sew over your beginning stitching line. Go ahead and reinforce those stitches by back stitching, and then you can go ahead and clip your threads. All right, so we have our double oven mitt all done. It's a little crinkly because of the insole bright in there, but it's gonna do great at keeping heat off. You can see it looks absolutely fantastic. It's really customizable. Let's take a closer look at how that zigzag stitch worked out, so you can decide if you'd rather do that or hand stitch. So from the front, everything looks great. That zigzag is just neatly over the seam of where that bias binding goes around. Everything looks absolutely fabulous. When we flip it over, it sometimes is a different story. In some places, like here, it is really kind of in far from the outside, but it has secured everything. And in some places over here, it's just right on the edge. But in every place, you can take a look, everything is nice and secure. It's not gonna go anywhere. So that's the main part. But if things like this bother you, grab a needle and thread and go for it. Otherwise, just use fabric or thread that's gonna match your fabric really well, and you won't see it that much because most of the time it's gonna look like that when it's over your oven, and you really are only gonna see the other side when you're pulling things out of your oven. This fabric is called Architecture School. It's available from FreeSpirit Fabrics. You can find it in a local quilt shop near you. Make sure to visit SIY-Sew-It-Yourself.com in order to find out where you can find a local or online store that is an SIY participating retailer to grab this from. It's always a great way to say thanks by getting the supplies you need from an SIY retailer to thank the Jaftex family of fabrics for providing these tutorials for you guys to inspire you and give you a project to take a look at for free. Again, you can find all that at SIY-Sew-It-Yourself.com. This is brought to you again by the Jaftex family of fabrics. That includes FreeSpirit, Henry Glass, Studio E, and Blank. All right, until next time, happy quilting.